Our marriage had started like any other fairy tale. A chance encounter at a coffee shop in the heart of Chicago, the kind that makes your heart beat a little faster. James had spilled his coffee, and in the midst of his flustered apologies, I saw the man who would become my husband. He was charming, with deep blue eyes and an easy smile that could melt away any of my worries. Now, 10 years later, the spark that once seemed so effortless had dimmed. The weight of daily life had settled in, and we both had drifted into the monotony of routine. James's job as an investment banker kept him at the office late most nights, and I was buried in my work as an interior designer. We moved through our lives like well-practiced dancers who had forgotten how to hear the music. There were moments when I wondered if he noticed me at all. We had tried to hold onto those fragile threads of our connection, but it was as if they were slipping through our fingers. The love was there, buried under layers of fatigue and resignation. It was as though we were living parallel lives, moving side by side but never truly intersecting. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of our living room, nursing a glass of wine, I couldn't ignore the emptiness that had settled between us. James was still at the office, working late on some high-stakes deal that seemed to consume every ounce of his time. I'd heard the same excuse too many times. I tried to be supportive, I really did, but the loneliness was becoming unbearable. As I scrolled mindlessly through my phone, a message appeared from Mark, an old friend from college. It had been years since we last spoke, but seeing his name brought a wave of nostalgia. Mark and I had been close back then, almost inseparable, and there had been a time when I thought maybe there could be more. But life had other plans, and we drifted apart. Still, seeing his message reminded me of who I used to be, a person full of life and passion. Before marriage, before the routines that had dulled my edges. His message was innocent enough. "Hey Sarah, it's been ages. Just stumbled on some old photos and thought of you. How have you been?" I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was almost 9 p.m., and James hadn't even texted to say he'd be late. Again. With a sigh, I typed a response. "Mark, wow, long time no see. I'm good. Just busy with life. How about you?" We exchanged a few more messages, and soon the conversation flowed effortlessly. We reminisced about our college days, laughed over silly memories, and for the first time in a while, I felt alive again. It wasn't about Mark specifically. It was about the version of myself I had buried somewhere along the way. It wasn't until nearly midnight that James finally came home, exhausted, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. I could see the weariness in his eyes, the strain of yet another grueling day. He gave me a weak smile and kissed my forehead before heading to the kitchen for a quick snack. "How was work?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Long, stressful," he replied, his voice hollow. "I'm sorry I'm late, Sarah. I promise things will calm down soon." I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard that line too many times. Still, I didn't push. Instead, I finished my wine and quietly went to bed, leaving him to his thoughts and his late-night snack. As I lay there in the darkness, I found myself reaching for my phone, tempted to scroll through the conversation with Mark once more, but I stopped myself. I wasn't looking for anything more than a reminder of who I used to be, or so I told myself. Would you like me to continue the story?
Вы сказали: «Продолжай как можно дольше». Чат сказал.
Part 2: Old Flames and New Doubts. The next few days passed in a blur. James's schedule hadn't changed, and the distance between us seemed to grow with each passing evening. Our conversations were brief, almost obligatory. I would ask him how his day was, and he would answer with a few words before retreating into his own world. I missed him, and I wasn't sure if he even noticed. Meanwhile, Mark and I continued to exchange messages. What started as a casual catching up began to grow into something deeper, though neither of us acknowledged it directly. I found myself looking forward to his messages, craving the excitement they brought into my otherwise routine days. It was as if a small part of me had been reawakened, a spark I thought had long since burned out. Mark's messages weren't overtly flirtatious, but there was a familiarity, a warmth, that felt like coming home. I knew it was dangerous territory, but I kept convincing myself it was harmless. We were just old friends reconnecting. Yet, A small voice inside me questioned why I felt the need to hide my conversations with him. I never told James about Mark reaching out. Then again, James hardly seemed interested in anything I was doing these days. One Saturday afternoon, James was, as usual, at the office. I decided to meet Mark for coffee. We both agreed it would be nice to catch up in person after so many years. There was no harm in meeting a friend, I thought. It was just coffee. We chose a small cafe downtown, not far from where we used to hang out back in college. When I arrived, I saw Mark immediately, standing by the window, looking almost exactly as I remembered. Except now, he carried a bit more maturity in his features, a touch of gray in his hair that suited him well. He greeted me with a warm smile and a hug that lingered a moment longer than expected. "It's really great to see you, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with genuine affection. "You too, Mark," I replied, feeling a rush of nostalgia as we sat down. We chatted easily, like no time had passed at all. It wasn't just the memories that came flooding back. It was the way he made me feel seen, listened to. He asked about my life, my work, and even about James. I kept it vague, not wanting to delve into the growing emptiness of my marriage. As we sipped our coffee, he leaned in a little closer, his eyes searching mine. "Are you happy, Sarah?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt a twinge of guilt flutter in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "I guess life just gets in the way, you know? Things are fine, really." It was a lie, and I think he knew it. Mark reached out and gently touched my hand, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. It was a simple gesture, but it felt so intimate, as though he was reaching into a part of my soul that I'd kept locked away for years. My breath caught, and I withdrew my hand, trying to regain my composure. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I interrupted, my voice a little shaky. "I should probably get going, actually. There's a lot I need to get done today." I was lying again, but I needed to put some distance between us before I did something I might regret. As I stood up to leave, Mark reached for my arm. "Sarah, I just want you to be happy, that's all. You deserve that." His words echoed in my mind long after I left the cafe. The truth was, I wasn't happy, and I wasn't sure if I remembered how to be. James and I had once had that magic, that sense of connection, but somewhere along the way, it had slipped through our fingers. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. Part 3. The guilt and the distance. I didn't mention the meeting to James. He wouldn't have understood why I needed to reconnect with someone from the past, especially now. Besides, we barely spoke that evening, even though he came home at a reasonable hour for a change. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the words we didn't say, the feelings we didn't acknowledge. I kept thinking about Mark's question, "Are you happy?" The answer was more complicated than I wanted to admit. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. James was either at the office late or too exhausted to engage in anything beyond the basic exchanges. I stopped asking him about work, and he stopped pretending things would change. It wasn't that we were fighting. We were simply drifting apart without saying it out loud. It was easier that way. Mark and I kept talking, though I resisted meeting up again. Our messages were becoming more frequent, a source of comfort and escape. I was drawn to him even if I wasn't entirely sure why. There was a part of me that wanted to tell him everything, but I knew I couldn't. It wasn't fair to James or to myself. Still, I couldn't stop. I felt alive when I talked to Mark, as though I was waking up from a long, dull slumber. Then came the night everything changed. James had texted that he'd be working late again. Nothing new there. I was sitting on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through TV channels when my phone buzzed. It was Mark, suggesting we meet up for a drink. "I know it's last minute, but I could really use a friend right now. It's been a rough day," he wrote. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. There was a part of me that knew this was a dangerous line to cross, but another part, a louder part, was tired of being lonely. "Okay," I replied. "I'll meet you. Would you like to continue reading about what happens next? The story is about to take a more intense turn."
Вы сказали: «Продолжай как можно дольше». Чат сказал.
Part 4. The first step over the line. I drove to a cozy bar that Mark had suggested. It wasn't far from the cafe where we'd met before, but it had a completely different vibe. A dimly lit, intimate atmosphere that made it feel like the kind of place where secrets were kept. As I walked in, I saw Mark sitting at a small table near the back, nursing a glass of whiskey. He looked up, his eyes lighting up as he saw me, and he stood to greet me with that familiar warmth that seemed to erase all the years between us. "I'm glad you could make it," he said, pulling out a chair for me. "It's good to see you too," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I sat down. We talked for hours, our conversation flowing with the ease of two people who had once shared everything. The drinks loosened our tongues, and before long, I found myself confiding in Mark about my struggles with James. It felt strange, opening up to someone who wasn't my husband, but at the same time, it was liberating to finally say the words I'd kept locked inside for so long. "I'm not sure when things started to change," I said, swirling my wine glass. "It's like we're living two separate lives. He's always at work, and when he's home, he's just distant. We don't even fight anymore. We just coexist." The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Mark reached across the table, covering my hand with his. His touch was gentle but firm, as if anchoring me in the moment. "Sarah, you don't have to go through this alone," he said softly. "You deserve to feel loved and appreciated." A part of me wanted to pull my hand away, to stop whatever this was before it could go any further. But I didn't. I let his hand linger over mine, feeling the warmth of his skin against my own. There was a comfort in his touch, a solace I hadn't felt in so long. It wasn't long before we found ourselves leaving the bar together. It was late, and the chill of the night air seemed to sharpen everything. My senses, my thoughts, and the awareness of what I was about to do. Mark walked me to my car, and we stood there in the dark parking lot, just looking at each other. I could see the question in his eyes, the unspoken invitation that hung between us. "I should go," I whispered, my voice betraying the hesitation that gripped me. It isn't right." Mark stepped closer, his breath warm against my cheek. "I'm not asking for anything, Sarah," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you, whatever you need." And then, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. It was just a kiss, soft, tentative, but enough to send a jolt of electricity through me. It was the first real spark I'd felt in years. I pulled away quickly, my heart racing. "I'm sorry," I said, taking a step back. "I can't. I need to think." Mark nodded, his expression a mix of understanding and longing. "It's okay, Sarah. You don't owe me an explanation. Just take care of yourself, all right?" I drove home with my mind spinning, a rush of guilt and exhilaration flooding through me. When I walked through the door, the house was dark and quiet. James was already asleep. I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed bedroom door, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. It was just a kiss, I told myself, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it was the first step over a line I couldn't uncross. Part 5. The Pull of Temptation. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. I told myself that I would stop talking to Mark, that I needed to focus on my marriage, but a part of me craved the connection we had rekindled. It wasn't just about Mark. It was about the way he made me feel, like I was seen, valued, and desired. James, meanwhile, hadn't noticed a change in me. His work continued to consume him, and the distance between us grew wider with each passing day. I tried to bring up the idea of us going away for a weekend together, just the two of us, but he brushed it off, saying he was too busy at the moment. There was always some deal or project that took priority. The loneliness crept back in, stronger this time, because now I had felt a glimpse of something different. It was getting harder to resist the pull of temptation. Every time I saw Mark's name flash on my phone, my pulse quickened. I started to think about him more and more, wondering what it would be like if I allowed myself to go further down this path. Then, one afternoon, he texted me, asking if I could meet him for lunch. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I also felt powerless to stop. I agreed, telling myself that it was just lunch, that I could control the situation. When I arrived at the restaurant, Mark was already there, sitting at a corner table with a view of the city streets. He looked up and smiled as I approached, and I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. We talked over salads and iced tea, our conversation light and friendly at first. But soon the mood shifted. I found myself opening up to him again, sharing more than I intended. He listened with a kind of attentiveness that I hadn't felt in so long, and I could feel myself being drawn in, bit by bit. After lunch, we walked together along the riverfront. The city seemed alive around us, but I felt like we were in our own little world. Mark's hand brushed against mine as we walked, and before I knew it, we were holding hands, the connection feeling so natural, so right. We stopped on a bridge, and he turned to face me. "Sarah, I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know what this means for us or what you want, but I can't pretend there's nothing here." I looked into his eyes and saw the same longing reflected back at me. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt completely untethered, as though I could float away. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, "but I can't seem to stay away from you either." Mark reached up to touch my face, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. I leaned into his touch, and before I could think, our lips met again, this time with a hunger that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release of everything I had been holding back. When we finally broke apart, I felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. I was crossing a line, deeper than I had before, and there was no going back now. Mark's eyes searched mine, as though looking for reassurance. "Sarah," he said softly, "we don't have to figure everything out right now. Let's just take this one step at a time." I nodded, though I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. I was standing on the edge of a precipice, and all I could do was hold my breath and step forward. Would you like to continue the story? It's about to delve even deeper into the complexities of love, temptation, and the choices that can forever alter the course of a relationship.
Вы сказали. Продолжай как можно дольше. Чат сказал.
Part 6. Deeper into the abyss. The days and weeks that followed felt like living a double life. By day, I was Sarah, the devoted wife trying to hold her marriage together. By night, I was consumed by thoughts of Mark and the moments we stole together. Our meetings became more frequent, each time pushing the boundaries of what was once considered innocent. It wasn't just the physical connection. It was the emotional intimacy that scared me. I was sharing parts of myself with Mark that I hadn't shared with James in years. I didn't plan for it to go this far. In the beginning, it was just a distraction, a temporary escape from the loneliness that had settled into my marriage. But now, as Mark and I grew closer, I found myself questioning everything. My love for James, the life we'd built, and even who I had become. James didn't seem to notice the changes in me. He was still consumed by work, still arriving home late most nights, and still retreating into silence when he did manage to be present. Sometimes, I would look at him across the dinner table and wonder if he felt it too. The distance, the emptiness that stretched between us. It was as though we were merely going through the motions, playing the roles of husband and wife without any real connection. One night, after a particularly late evening at the office, James came home to find me sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone. I quickly put it down, as if caught doing something I wasn't supposed to. His eyes lingered on me, a question forming on his lips. "Who were you talking to?" he asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. It was a rare moment of awareness, one that caught me off guard. "Just an old friend from college," I replied casually, hoping to brush it off. "Mark, remember him? We reconnected recently." James's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something. Jealousy, perhaps? Or was it simply exhaustion? "Oh yeah," he said, his tone flat. "How is he?" "He's fine," I said, forcing a smile. "We just catch up every now and then." James didn't push the conversation any further, and I didn't offer more. It was a relief in a way that he didn't pry. but it was also a reminder of just how far apart we had drifted. There had been a time when he would have cared, when he would have wanted to know every detail of my day. Now, it seemed like we were just two people sharing a house rather than a life. Part 7, a dangerous game. It didn't take long for things with Mark to escalate further. The longing between us had reached a point where neither of us could deny what was happening. We began meeting at his apartment on the afternoons when I knew James would be tied up at work. It was easy to justify at first. I was simply filling the void left by my husband's absence. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized I was playing a dangerous game, one that could only end in heartbreak. Every time I crossed the threshold into Mark's apartment, I felt a mix of thrill and guilt. The first time we made love, it was slow, tentative, as though we were both testing the waters of something forbidden. But with each meeting, the passion grew stronger, more urgent, and the guilt began to dull in the face of what I felt for him. It wasn't just the physical connection that drew me to Mark. It was the way he made me feel, alive, desired, understood. Yet, after every stolen afternoon, reality would crash down on me the moment I stepped back into my home. The guilt would swell in my chest like a heavy stone, and I would promise myself that it was the last time. But it never was. The pull was too strong and I was too weak to resist. Then, one day, as I was leaving Mark's apartment, I saw someone I recognized in the lobby, one of James's colleagues from the office. Our eyes met briefly and I felt my stomach drop. I turned quickly, pretending not to notice him, but the encounter left me shaken. It was a stark reminder of the risks I was taking, the damage I could cause if my secret ever came to light. That evening, I was unusually quiet. James noticed, and for the first time in a long time, he seemed genuinely concerned. "Sarah, is everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing with worry. I forced a smile, shaking off the anxiety that had been building all day. "I'm fine, just tired," I said, brushing him off as I had done so many times before. But I wasn't fine. I was terrified that the house of cards I'd built was about to come crashing down, that one slip-up would expose everything and leave my life in ruins. And yet, even knowing the risk, I couldn't bring myself to end things with Mark. I was in too deep. It wasn't just a fling anymore. I was falling in love with him, and that was the most dangerous part of all. Part 8. A choice to make. The confrontation I feared didn't come right away. Days passed without incident, but the encounter in the lobby had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just the fear of being caught. It was the realization that I was living a lie on both sides. I wasn't honest with James, but I wasn't entirely honest with Mark either. I had never told him just how deep my relationship with my husband had once been, how much I had loved James before the silence crept in. Mark deserved better than to be someone's escape. I knew that, and James deserved the truth, or at the very least, a wife who was fully committed to the marriage she had vowed to honor. I was at a crossroads, and I had to decide which path I was going to take. I couldn't keep living two lives. It was during one of those quiet evenings at home, when James and I were sitting together in the living room, that I finally felt the weight of my choices closing in on me. He was watching TV, his face lit by the glow of the screen, and I found myself studying him, really seeing him for the first time in months. He looked tired, worn down by the stresses of his job, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was feeling the same distance that I was. "James?" I said quietly, my voice almost trembling. "Can we talk?" He glanced at me, a mixture of curiosity and concern in his eyes. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to confess everything right then and there, to lay bare all the secrets and lies that had come to define our relationship. But the words caught in my throat. How could I explain to him that I had found comfort in the arms of another man, that I had betrayed the vows we had made so long ago? It's just, I hesitated, forcing myself to keep going. "I feel like we've been drifting apart lately, like we're not really connected anymore." James's expression softened, and he reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I know," he admitted. "I felt it too. Work has been overwhelming, and I know I haven't been around as much as I should be. But I don't want to lose you, Sarah. We can fix this, can't we? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the first time in so long that he had openly acknowledged our struggles, and there was a sincerity in his voice that made me realize how deeply I still cared for him. But it wasn't enough to erase the past few months, or the feelings I had developed for Mark. I was torn between two worlds, two loves, and I didn't know which one to choose. Would you like me to continue the story? It's reaching a point where Sarah's decisions could lead to significant consequences, with the potential to reshape her entire life.
Вы сказали. Продолжай как можно дольше. Чат сказал.
Part 9. An unexpected revelation. The conversation with James left me feeling conflicted and raw. He wanted to fix things, to try and mend the cracks that had spread through our marriage. There was still a part of me that loved him, that longed to see us reconnect and rediscover the passion we once had. But there was also the part of me that was drawn to Mark, to the excitement and desire that he stirred within me. I didn't know how to reconcile these two sides of myself. It felt as though I was standing at the edge of a precipice, with James on one side, offering stability and a shared history, and Mark on the other, representing the thrill of the unknown. And all the while, the guilt continued to weigh heavily on me, threatening to drag me under. A few days later, Mark texted me, asking if we could meet. He said he had something important to tell me, and his message carried an urgency that made my stomach twist with anxiety. I agreed to see him, though I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had to say would change everything. We met at his apartment again, and as soon as I walked in, I could tell something was different. Mark's usual easygoing demeanor was replaced by a tension I had never seen in him before. He looked at me with a mix of concern and determination, and for a moment, I feared that he was going to end things, that he was going to say he couldn't do this anymore. Sarah, he began, his voice unsteady. I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you're going to take it. My heart sank, and I prepared myself for the worst. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself. I'm in love with you, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. I know this isn't fair, and I know you're still trying to figure things out with James, but I can't keep pretending that what we have is just some temporary fling. I want more. I want you. His confession hit me like a tidal wave, washing over me with a mix of elation and dread. Part of me had longed to hear those words, to know that what we shared was more than just a distraction for him. But the reality of it was more complicated than either of us wanted to admit. If Mark loved me, then this wasn't just an affair. It was a real choice I would have to make, a choice between two men who both had a claim on my heart. Mark, I began, my voice shaking, I care about you so much, but I don't know if I can just walk away from my marriage. It's not that simple. He took a step closer, his eyes pleading with me. I'm not asking you to walk away, Sarah. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself, with me, and with James. If there's still something worth fighting for in your marriage, then fight for it. But if there isn't, don't let guilt keep you trapped in a life that doesn't make you happy. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I listened to his words. He was right, of course. I had been using my relationship with Mark as an escape, a way to avoid facing the real issues in my marriage. But now, with his love laid bare in front of me, I couldn't keep running from the truth. I had to make a choice, and I had to do it soon. Part 10. Facing the truth. The drive home from Mark's place felt like a blur. His confession had forced me to confront feelings I had tried to bury, and the weight of my indecision was suffocating. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed James's car already there, a reminder that I had a husband waiting for me inside. I wasn't ready to face him, not with Mark's words still echoing in my mind. I lingered outside for a moment, taking deep breaths to steady myself before finally walking through the door. James was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, a sight that was becoming more common in recent days. It was as though he was making an effort, trying to show me that he could be present, that he still cared. Hey, you're home early, he said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. Yeah, I replied, my voice wavering. I just felt like coming home. I watched him for a moment as he moved about the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a kind of quiet concentration. There was a familiarity in the scene, a warmth that I hadn't noticed in so long. It reminded me of the early days of our marriage, when we used to cook together and laugh over burned dinners. The nostalgia brought a lump to my throat, and I found myself wondering if we had truly lost our way or if we had simply forgotten how to find each other. I sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly feeling the need to talk. "James, I think we need to be honest with each other," I began, my hands trembling. He stopped what he was doing and turned to face me, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "What do you mean?" I swallowed hard, the words struggling to come out. I've been feeling disconnected for a long time. It's not just the work or the late nights. It's like we've stopped being us. You know? James's eyes darkened with an emotion I couldn't quite read. Regret, maybe, or perhaps a recognition of the truth in my words. "I know," he said quietly. "I felt it too, but I thought we were just going through a rough patch. I didn't realize how much it was affecting you." "It's more than just a rough patch," I said, my voice barely holding steady. "I've been seeing someone else. It started out as just talking, but it became more than that." The look on James's face was one of shock, then hurt, and finally, a kind of resignation. He took a step back, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of my confession had physically struck him. "How long?" he asked, his voice strained. "A few months," I admitted. "It wasn't planned. I never meant for it to go this far, but it did. And now, I don't know what to do." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could see the hurt etched into his features, the pain I had caused with my actions. And in that moment, I hated myself for what I had done. For betraying the man who had once been my best friend, the man I had promised to love forever. James finally spoke, his voice low and broken. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air, and I realized I didn't have an answer. I had feelings for Mark, that was undeniable. But love? What did that even mean now, in the tangled web of guilt and longing that my life had become? "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know what I feel anymore." James nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with emotion. "I guess that says it all, doesn't it?" Part 11. Picking up the pieces. That night, James slept in the guest room. It was the first time in our marriage that we hadn't shared a bed, and the distance between us felt like a physical barrier I couldn't cross. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the day over and over in my mind. I had finally told the truth, but I wasn't sure if it had brought me any closer to the answers I was seeking. The next morning, James was gone before I woke up. He left a note on the kitchen counter saying he needed some time to think, and I couldn't blame him. I needed time too, time to figure out what I really wanted and whether there was anything left to salvage in our marriage. Over the next few days, I didn't hear from Mark or James. I was alone with my thoughts, and in that silence, I started to realize just how lost I had become. I had been so focused on escaping my unhappiness that I hadn't taken the time to understand its source. It wasn't just about James or Mark. It was about me and the person I had allowed myself to become. When James finally came home, he looked exhausted, as though he had aged years in just a few days. We sat down at the dining table, facing each other like strangers trying to navigate a conversation. "I've thought a lot about what you said," he began, his voice measured. "And I don't know if we can fix this, but I'm willing to try, if you are." His words caught me by surprise. I had expected anger, accusations, maybe even a decision to end things. But instead, he was offering a glimmer of hope. "I want to try too," I said, tears filling my eyes. "I don't know if we can go back to the way things were, but I want to see if we can find something new, something better." The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and I knew that even if we could heal, it would take time. I still had feelings for Mark, feelings that wouldn't simply vanish overnight. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of clarity, a desire to face the reality of my life and to take responsibility for the choices I had made. Shall I keep going? The story is heading toward a point where Sarah and James will try to rebuild their marriage, and Sarah will have to make a definitive decision about her relationship with Mark.
Вы сказали. Продолжай как можно дольше. Чат сказал.
Part 12, The Beginning of Healing. As the days passed, James and I tiptoed around the topic of my infidelity, neither of us knowing how to fully address it. We agreed to start couples counseling to see if there was a way forward. Our first session was tense, filled with long silences and hesitant confessions. The therapist asked us to be honest about what we both wanted, and for the first time we spoke openly about the problems that had driven us apart. James admitted that he had been using work as an escape, a way to avoid confronting the issues in our marriage. He was deeply hurt by my betrayal, but he acknowledged that his own emotional withdrawal had played a role in creating the distance between us. I thought if I just kept my head down and worked hard, things would get better, he said, his voice filled with regret. But I didn't realize I was pushing you away. Hearing him say that stirred something in me. I hadn't expected him to take any responsibility, but his willingness to share the blame made me see the situation in a different light. We were both responsible for the collapse of our marriage. We had both let the spark fade, and I had chosen to seek comfort elsewhere rather than addressing the real issues. I'm sorry too, I said, my voice trembling. I should have told you how lonely I felt. I should have fought harder for us instead of what I did. The therapist nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. It's good that you're both acknowledging the pain and taking responsibility. This is the first step toward healing, but there's a lot of work to be done. Are you both willing to put in that work? James and I exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between us. We were far from okay, but there was a flicker of hope, small, fragile, but enough to give us a reason to try. We agreed to commit to the counseling, to make time for each other, and to start communicating in a way we hadn't for years. It was a beginning, though not without its challenges. Part 13, Letting Go of Mark. As James and I started to rebuild our relationship, I found myself struggling with my feelings for Mark. Despite my efforts to focus on my marriage, Mark remained a constant presence in my mind. I hadn't seen him or spoken to him since the day I confessed to James, and the absence left a hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't fair to James to keep holding on to feelings for another man, but I wasn't sure how to let go. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room while James was upstairs, I made the difficult decision to call Mark. My hand trembled as I dialed his number, not knowing how he would react or what I would even say. When he picked up, his voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of emotion. "Sarah," he said, his tone soft but strained. "I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you again." "I know," I replied, my heart aching at the sound of his voice. "I'm sorry I disappeared. I needed time to figure things out." "And did you?" he asked, a hint of hope and sadness in his voice. I hesitated, knowing that what I was about to say would hurt him. "James and I, we're trying to make it work. We're in counseling. I don't know what the future holds, but I owe it to him, to us, to try." There was a long silence on the other end, and when Mark finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I understand," he said quietly. I wish things had been different. But if this is what you need to do, then I can't stand in your way." "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," Mark replied, and there was a finality in his tone that made my heart break. "Take care, Sarah." As the call ended, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss. It was as if I was saying goodbye not just to Mark, but to the version of myself I had been when I was with him, the person who felt alive and desired. But I knew it was a necessary step if I wanted to give my marriage a real chance. I couldn't hold on to the past if I wanted to move forward. Part 14, Relearning Each Other. In the weeks that followed, James and I began to rediscover each other in small, tentative steps. The counseling sessions were starting to help, giving us tools to communicate better and work through the lingering resentment. We learned to be vulnerable again, to share the fears and insecurities that had driven us apart in the first place. We started making time for just the two of us. It was a slow process. At first, it felt awkward, like we were dating again but without the initial excitement. But gradually, there were moments that reminded me of why I fell in love with James in the first place. He could still make me laugh, still comfort me when I was feeling down. It wasn't as though everything suddenly clicked back into place, but it was a start. One evening, as we were lying in bed, James turned to me and asked, "Do you think we'll ever be the same?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "No," I said honestly. "But maybe we don't need to be. Maybe we can be something different, something better." He looked at me with a softness in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. "I'd like that," he said, pulling me closer. That night was the first time in months that we made love. It wasn't the desperate, passionate reunion I had fantasized about. It was slow and gentle, an act of reaching out and finding each other again. And though there were still layers of hurt between us, it felt like a step toward healing, a promise of the work we still had to do. Part 15. The Road to Forgiveness. The process of rebuilding our marriage wasn't linear. There were days when we fell back into old patterns, when the tension crept back in and old wounds resurfaced. There were moments when I doubted whether we could ever truly move past what had happened. But James and I were both committed to the process, and slowly our relationship began to transform. The hardest part was forgiving myself. It was one thing for James to decide to give our marriage another chance, but another for me to release the guilt I carried. I struggled to understand how I had let myself stray so far from the person I thought I was, how I had justified my actions when I knew deep down that I was betraying my husband. It took time, but the counseling helped me see that it wasn't just one decision that had led me down that path. It was a series of small choices, each one made in a moment of weakness or loneliness. James's forgiveness, though not immediate, eventually felt genuine. He didn't bring up my infidelity during arguments, didn't use it as a weapon. There were times when I caught a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but he always seemed to choose love over anger. That was something I hadn't expected. I thought the betrayal would linger between us like a ghost, always reminding us of what I had done. But somehow, James found a way to let go, to trust that we could build something new from the ashes. As for Mark, I never heard from him again after that phone call. There were moments when I thought about reaching out to check on him, to see if he was okay. But I knew that would only hurt him further. The best thing I could do for Mark, and for myself, was to let him go, to allow him to heal without me in his life. Part 16. A Different Kind of Love. Months later, as spring began to thaw the cold of winter, I realized that James and I had found a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when the past weighed heavily on us, when I felt the pang of regret or he seemed distant. But we had also found moments of real connection, times when we laughed together, or shared quiet conversations that reminded me of the early years. Our love had changed. It wasn't the same as it had been before the affair, but maybe that was a good thing. We were no longer the couple who took each other for granted. We were no longer content to let life drift by without making an effort to stay close. We had learned to prioritize each other, to recognize when we needed to reconnect before the distance could grow again. One evening, as we sat on the porch, sipping glasses of wine, James looked at me and said, "I'm proud of us, for not giving up." I turned to him, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I'm proud of us too," I replied. "We've come a long way." There was no guarantee of a happily ever after. Life didn't work that way, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that our love was strong enough to endure the struggles, that we were capable of growing and changing together. I had let go of the fantasy of the perfect marriage and embraced the reality of what we were. A couple who had faced the brink of collapse and come back stronger. A couple who chose each other every day, even when it wasn't easy. And in that choice, in the daily effort to love and forgive, I found a different kind of happiness, one built not on illusion, but on the truth that we had fought for each other, that we had found a way to stay despite everything that tried to tear us apart. Would you like to continue? I could explore the story's aftermath further or provide a different perspective on their journey. 2 of 2.
Вы сказали. Продолжи историю соблазн измены. Чат сказал.
Part 17. The Temptation Never Ends. The months passed, and despite the progress James and I had made, the shadow of temptation never fully disappeared. The routine of life had returned, but it was different now. It was conscious and deliberate, not the automatic existence we had slipped into before. We were working on our marriage, and there was genuine effort on both sides to make things better. But as much as I wanted to believe that my affair with Mark was just a chapter in the past, I still found myself haunted by the thrill of it, the longing that had once been so intoxicating. Mark had stayed out of my life just as I had asked, but memories of our time together surfaced at the most unexpected moments. A familiar song on the radio, a phrase he used to say, even the scent of his cologne on a passerby. These small reminders felt like echoes from a life that wasn't fully behind me. I hadn't planned on reaching out to him again, but as time wore on, I found myself grappling with the idea of closure. Did I ever truly have it? James and I had made love again and again, and in many ways our intimacy had deepened. Yet, there were moments when I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if something was still missing. It wasn't just the excitement Mark had brought into my life. It was the part of myself that I had felt alive with him. The version of me that didn't have to be a perfect wife, that didn't have to constantly struggle to be everything to everyone. Then, one Friday afternoon, temptation found me again. I was leaving a client's office downtown when I spotted Mark walking on the other side of the street. He was alone, deep in thought, and hadn't seen me. My heart skipped a beat, a sudden rush of adrenaline coursing through me. I told myself to just keep walking, to look away and ignore him. But my feet seemed to have a mind of their own, and before I knew it, I was crossing the street, making my way toward him. "Mark!" I called out, my voice almost trembling. He turned at the sound of my voice, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the weight of all the unspoken things between us hung in the air. Finally, he managed a small, bittersweet smile. "Sarah, I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect it either," I replied, feeling my pulse quicken. "How have you been?" "I've been fine," he said, though the hesitation in his voice told me otherwise. "And you? How are things with you and James?" "We're working on it," I said carefully. "It's not easy, but we're trying." Mark nodded, his expression softening. "That's good to hear. I'm glad you're giving it a real chance." There was an awkward silence, the kind that only happens between two people who have shared too much and yet not enough. I wanted to walk away, to say that this was a chance encounter and nothing more. But I also found myself craving one more conversation, one last moment of honesty before we both went our separate ways for good. "Do you have a few minutes?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "Just to catch up?" Mark hesitated, glancing at his watch before meeting my eyes again. "Sure," he said. "Why not?" Part 18, The Dangerous Conversation. We found a nearby cafe, one that was quiet and dimly lit, as though offering us the privacy to speak freely. Sitting across from him brought a flood of memories rushing back. It was strange how familiar it felt, how easily we could fall back into old patterns, even after so much time had passed. We talked about the usual things at first: work, life, how we'd been keeping busy. It was casual, surface-level conversation that didn't touch the real reason I had asked him to join me. But as the minutes ticked by, I could sense the tension building, the unspoken question that lingered between us. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. "After everything, I thought that was it." "I know," I replied, feeling a twinge of guilt. "It should have been, but I guess I never got the closure I needed." Mark's eyes searched mine, as though trying to understand what I was really saying. "Closure," he echoed. "Is that what you're looking for? Or is there something else?" I swallowed hard, unsure of how to answer. I had come here under the pretense of closure, but there was a part of me, a part one didn't want to admit, that craved more than that. It wasn't just about tying up loose ends. It was about the temptation that still lived inside me, the part that wasn't quite ready to let go. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I thought I was over this, over us. But seeing you today, it just brought everything back." Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression pained yet understanding. "I won't lie, Sarah. I still think about you. There hasn't been a day when I haven't wondered what might have happened if things had been different." His words hung in the air like a spark, setting off a familiar fire within me. It was the same feeling I had tried to escape, the same pull that had led me down a dangerous path months ago. I knew I should get up and leave, that I should walk away before I made another mistake. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong, the temptation too real. Part 19. Falling again. The cafe started to feel stifling, the closeness between us almost unbearable. Mark's gaze lingered on me, as if waiting for me to make the next move, and I found myself saying words I knew I shouldn't. Maybe we should go somewhere else, I suggested, my voice barely audible. Somewhere we can talk. Mark's eyes flashed with a mixture of desire and uncertainty, but he nodded. Let's go, he said, his voice low. We left the cafe, our steps quickening as we walked toward his apartment, as if the faster we moved, the less likely we were to talk ourselves out of it. When we reached his door, there was a moment of hesitation, a last opportunity to back out, to turn around and walk away. But as soon as we stepped inside, any thoughts of stopping vanished. The moment the door closed behind us, I felt Mark's hands on me, pulling me close, his lips pressing against mine with a hunger that matched my own. It was different from the last time, more desperate, as if we both knew this was our last chance to indulge in what we had before reality crashed back in. We stumbled toward the bedroom, shedding layers of clothing and restraint, and when we finally came together, it was as though nothing else existed. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the two of us in a blur of heat and passion. There was no time to think about the consequences, no room for guilt. There was only the feeling of being alive in a way I hadn't felt in months. But when it was over, reality came rushing back. As I lay next to him, the weight of what I had done settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had promised James that I would commit to rebuilding our marriage, and here I was, lying in another man's bed, betraying that promise all over again. The familiar wave of guilt and regret washed over me, stronger than before, and I realized just how deep I had fallen. Mark turned to me, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice filled with tenderness. "You don't have to leave. Stay with me, just for a little while." But I couldn't. I couldn't stay there and pretend that this was anything other than what it was. A moment of weakness, a surrender to temptation that threatened to undo everything I had fought for. I sat up, reaching for my clothes with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not daring to look at him. "I can't do this. Not again." Mark's face fell, but he didn't argue. He knew as well as I did that we had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. I dressed quickly and left his apartment without another word, my heart pounding as I walked back to my car. The weight of my actions bore down on me, and I knew that this time, the consequences would be unavoidable. Part 20. The consequences come knocking. The drive home was agonizing. The guilt was suffocating, and I found myself rehearsing excuses and explanations in my mind, even though I knew there were none that could justify what I had done. I had betrayed James all over again, despite everything we had been through. There was no way to hide from the truth this time. When I arrived home, James was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and the dread that had been simmering in my gut exploded into full-blown panic. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I had a meeting downtown," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I know where you were." The floor seemed to drop out from under me, and my breath caught in my throat. "James, I saw you," he interrupted, his voice cracking with the weight of betrayal. "I saw you with him. I followed you from the cafe." The room spun, and I reached out to steady myself against the wall. The one thing I had feared most had come to pass. I had been caught, and there was no talking my way out of it. I had broken my husband's heart again, and this time, I didn't know if there was any way to repair the damage. Shall I continue the story? It's reaching a turning point where the consequences of Sarah's actions will become inescapable.
Вы сказали. Заканчивай историю. Чат сказал.
Part 21. The Shattered Trust. The truth lay between us, raw and undeniable. James's words hung in the air like a sharp, jagged blade, cutting through any hope I had of denying or explaining away my betrayal. There was no more hiding, no more pretending that everything could be salvaged. I had crossed the line once again, and this time there would be no second chance. James sat at the table, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, disbelief, and a glimmer of anger. I could see that he was trying to hold himself together, but his clenched jaw and trembling hands betrayed the depth of his hurt. "I tried, Sarah," he said, his voice low and unsteady. "I really tried to make this work. We both did. But I can't." He stopped, as if struggling to find the words that would capture the devastation he felt. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when you've clearly made your choice." His words stung not because they were unfair, but because they were the truth. He had tried. We had tried. And yet, despite our efforts, I had failed to stay faithful. I had given in to temptation, not once but twice, and now the consequences were inescapable. There was no one to blame but myself. I took a step closer to him, my voice breaking as I spoke. "James, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted it to go this far." The tears welled up, blurring my vision as the weight of everything came crashing down. "I don't know why I did it. I don't know why I let it happen again." James shook his head, his expression hardening as he stood up from the table. "You don't know why?" he echoed, his voice rising with frustration. "You don't know why you lied to me, betrayed me, again? After everything we went through, after all the work we put into trying to rebuild what you tore apart the first time." His eyes bore into mine, and I could see the love we once shared being eclipsed by a growing sense of finality. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, that might make a difference, but the words caught in my throat. There was nothing left to say. I had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way, and we both knew it. He looked at me for what felt like an eternity before finally turning away. His voice strained. "I need some space, Sarah. I need time to figure out what I'm going to do next. Because right now, I can't even look at you." His words felt like a knife twisting in my chest, but I nodded, knowing I had no right to ask for more. "I understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Take whatever time you need." Without another word, James walked past me, grabbing his coat and keys as he headed for the door. I watched him leave, the sound of the door closing echoing through the house, leaving behind a silence that was suffocating. Part 22. The end of us. The days that followed were the longest I had ever endured. James didn't come home, and the emptiness of the house became a constant reminder of the destruction I had caused. I reached out to him, but he only responded with short, distant messages, making it clear that he needed time and space. I knew better than to push him. I had already done enough damage. Our therapist called to check in after we missed a few sessions, but I didn't know what to tell her. There didn't seem to be a point in continuing therapy when our relationship felt so irreparably broken. I had shattered the fragile trust we had tried to rebuild, and I didn't see how it could be put back together again. Mark tried to reach out once, sending a single text to see if I was okay. I didn't respond. There was no place for him in my life anymore, no matter how much a part of me had once wanted him to be. The affair had been a symptom of the deeper issues I refused to face, and any lingering attachment to him was just another form of escape that I couldn't afford. The mess I had made was my own, and I had to confront it alone. After 2 weeks of silence, James finally called. The moment I heard his voice, I felt my heart twist with a painful mix of hope and dread. He didn't sound angry, but there was a coldness in his tone that hadn't been there before. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice steady. "Yes, of course," I replied quickly, almost breathlessly. "Whenever you're ready." We met at a small park near our house, one we used to visit often in the early years of our marriage. It was a place filled with happier memories, and I wondered if James had chosen it deliberately, as a reminder of what we had lost. As we sat on a bench, the distance between us felt like a chasm. He didn't waste time getting to the point. "I've thought a lot about this," he began, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I wanted to believe we could move past everything, that we could rebuild. But the truth is, I can't get over what you did. I don't think I can ever fully trust you again. I felt the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I held them back. I had no right to cry, not now. I understand, I said quietly, my voice breaking. I can't expect you to forgive me for what I've done. I wish I could take it all back, but I know I can't. James finally looked at me, his expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. I think it's time for us to end this, Sarah, he said, each word hitting me like a hammer. It's not healthy for either of us to keep trying when we're just hurting each other. We've lost too much. The finality of his words was crushing, but I nodded, accepting that this was the only path left for us. I'm so sorry, James, I whispered, my voice trembling. I truly am. I know, he replied, his voice softening slightly. And I'm sorry too. I wish things had turned out differently. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our decision settling in. There was nothing more to say, no way to undo the damage that had been done. We had come to the end of our road, and all that was left was to say goodbye. Part 23. Starting over. The divorce was finalized within a few months. It was a painful and complicated process, but we kept it civil, knowing there was no need to prolong the suffering. James moved out of the house and I decided to sell it. There were too many memories, too many reminders of the life we had built and subsequently lost. I needed a fresh start, a clean slate where I could figure out who I was without the weight of my mistakes constantly pulling me down. I found a small apartment in a different part of the city. It wasn't much, but it felt like the right place to begin again. I threw myself into my work, trying to stay busy and keep my mind off everything that had happened. There were days when the loneliness was overwhelming, and the guilt still lingered like a shadow. But I had to learn to live with it, to accept that I had made choices that led me here. As time passed, the pain began to dull, replaced by a quiet resolve. I had lost a lot. My marriage, my sense of security, and even a part of myself. But I had also learned valuable lessons about love, fidelity, and the consequences of letting temptation dictate my actions. I had made mistakes, but I was determined not to let them define me. There was no fairy tale ending, no grand reconciliation or sudden redemption. Life wasn't a storybook. It was messy, imperfect, and filled with hard truths. But I had finally come to terms with that. I didn't know if I would ever find love again, or if I even deserved it. But I had learned to face my flaws, to accept my failures, and to take responsibility for my actions. And in that acceptance, I found the first steps toward healing. Epilogue. Moving forward. Years later, I heard that James had remarried. A part of me felt happy for him, knowing that he had found someone who could give him the kind of love and commitment I had failed to provide. As for Mark, I never saw him again. I didn't know if he found what he was looking for, but I hoped that he too had moved on, found peace, and left the past behind. I wasn't the same person I had been when this all began. The experience had changed me, forcing me to confront parts of myself I would have preferred to ignore. But it also made me stronger, more self-aware, and more capable of recognizing my own needs and flaws. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was ready to face it on my own terms, without the weight of regret holding me back. I had learned that temptation would always exist, but it was up to me to decide whether I would succumb to it or rise above it. In the end, I wasn't defined by my mistakes, but by how I chose to grow from them.